This is Joe Wong. Welcome to the Trap Set. During the age of social distancing, we're recording remotely and releasing episodes every day.
I played the long game, took my time to get here today. Had some good and bad days, I wouldn't have it any other way.
Today's guest is Jonathan Rice, whom you may know from his 20 years as a solo artist, for his work as a songwriter for films such as Walk the Line, Song 1, and Ricky and the Flash, or for his collaborations with artists such as Jenny Lewis and Elvis Costello.
Make yourself free to see how quickly
Jonathan spoke to me from his home in Los Angeles.
this good life goes by. Allow yourself to be happy.
Hello?
Jonathan,
Hey, Joe.
how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. How has your day been?
My day's been very good. Getting used to the first blast of the warm weather. And, today was a grocery day. So, had to brave the outside world, which I have been trying to be as diligent as possible, as not engaging with, but had to be done.
Is the way that you're structuring your time significantly different from what it's like absent coronavirus?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I guess, I'm a writer of all different things, of songs, of poems, all kinds of different writing related endeavors, and I think it's starting to kind of become part of I'm talking to other people who do what I do or do something similar to me. I don't know what your own experience is, but it's starting to, the consensus that I'm finding is that because what we're going through is so collectively psychologically taxing, it's hard to get anything done at all.
I can relate to that. I do a lot of work as a composer, and I've noticed that it's harder to get into my normal rhythm, and it's hard to be as productive as I am usually.
Yeah, same here.
When you think back to your childhood, what's the earliest memory that you can conjure up?
I think I remember the smell of the neighborhood of Denniston, Glasgow, which is where my grandfather and father grew up. And certain areas of Glasgow and of the UK have a really evocative, idiosyncratic smell, and it's of the distillery.
So you can smell peat?
I think, yeah, it's peat, and whatever other, alchemy is involved in making booze. I remember the smell of that neighborhood, and I remember the grounds of the little, because my grandfather was the janitor of a school there in Denniston, and there was a little house on the school property where he lived and where he raised his family, my father included.
It's almost like a real life groundskeeper Willie from The Simpsons.
By the way, like I grew up, so stoked on groundskeeper Willie, because I was like, that is my grandfather. He was not quite as barrel-chested and buff, but he did have like an explosive anger that
I
reminded me of, never towards me, but I could tell that, well, or maybe towards me a few times actually, um, yeah, I was like, wow, this is incredible. That I wondered if they had somehow met my grandfather, which has got, pretty next to impossible that they would have.
It's interesting that they chose for groundskeeper Willie to be Scottish, though.
I know. I imagine they just asked. I can't remember which actor did his
It
voice.
might be Hank Azaria.
It might be. I mean, he did so many.
Yeah,
And
they
does so
probably were
does
just
so
like,
many.
what accents can you do?
Yeah, that's kind of been part of the story of my life. In fact, Connor Oberst once said to me, "You're the only guy I know with 3 fake accents."
Is that true?
I don't think it's true, but it is true to him. And there's
Do
a
you
kernel of,
do you
there's a
mean that like
kernel of,
when you're with people that you tend to kind of assimilate and
absolutely.
but I think that's just a natural thing that happens linguistically for lots of people.
I think it is too, but I also think that it's a learned behavior. Like, yeah, I think it's natural and it's innate in us to do that. And it's a way of helping ourselves to belong and be accepted and all of those things. But, yeah, I think it's where my dad grew up in that part of Glasgow. It's the east end of Glasgow, which is essentially at the time when he was growing up I think you could fairly describe it as a Catholic ghetto. It's where the poor Irish Catholics who didn't for whatever reason didn't go all the way to America or elsewhere during the famine. So a big portion of them came to Glasgow, which was closer and just a couple hours ferry ride away from Ireland, and settled there. He grew up there, and the accent, especially in the East End, is so thick. Yeah, I mean, I guess the most obvious reference point is Trainspotting, which is technically set in Edinburgh, but there are a few Glasgow accents in the film. But yeah, it's kind of, people really do talk like that. And I grew up very much between those two cultures, and I probably felt a little bit like an outsider in both.
Well, you mentioned that Connor Oberst referred to 3 fake accents. I kind of feel
Yeah.
like it would behoove me to ask you to demonstrate them briefly.
I mean, that I think what he was saying was that I inhabit them all kind of simultaneously.
It's kind of true because when you picked up the phone, it sounded relatively American, and now I'm hearing a Scottish lilt come into play.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of all.
What happens if you drink a lot of alcohol?
It can get pretty Scottish.
Uh-huh.
It can get Scottish very quickly.
Yeah.
And
So there's Scottish and then
Buyer
there's
beware.
American, and then what else is there? Irish?
no, I think it's American, and then there's like a twinge because of Virginia, of maybe like a quasi kind of southern thing.
Ah, got it. Which, lots of the Irish people that didn't stop off in Scotland wound up in Virginia or in the south of America.
I believe that's where the term redneck comes from.
Because
It's
of the fair skin getting sunburned?
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh, interesting.
Could be wrong.
Well, that's a very interesting nugget. Tell me about the character of Denniston. You mentioned that you kind of characterized it as an Irish ghetto.
Yeah.
Was your family was your mother Irish as well?
Scottish.
And your father's family was ethnically Irish.
Yes, and so was my mother's.
Got it.
And she was from the West End, which was a little bit nicer. But yeah, the character of Denniston was deeply working class, and very, very rough. Home to almost Clockwork Orange-like levels of violence.
I mean,
Not
I've played in Glasgow a few times, and I really would be hard pressed to name a place where I've seen more severe hand to hand violence anywhere
Yeah,
in the world,
agreed.
especially as the bars are letting out at night after a
Yeah,
show.
yeah, and there is an element of sport to it. There's an inevitability to it. I think that is true. I mean, you've played. I know that you've toured everywhere and everything, but like, um, that is true in my experience all over the UK. There does seem to be like a Friday night in particular, a letting off of steam that happens.
It's almost like I can picture the people beating the shit out of each other and then going out for, breakfast in the morning together. It's
Yeah,
almost like a
absolutely.
bonding exercise.
Yeah, yeah. A doing, they'll call it. You better be careful. Or you'll get a doing.
So does that manifest in your personal life? Like you mentioned that your grandfather has an explosive temper. Do you have an explosive temper?
Um, I think that I have a temper, and I think when I was younger, I had less control over it, but um, I'm much softer, just in every way than the generation before me, and that's just because I had a much more comfortable life. So I did not grow up working class in Glasgow. I only visited there, and lived there for sometimes years at a time. But um, I think my primary way of looking at the world is probably through a pretty normal suburban kid, American kid. So that was my primary environment for most of my life. Was a very quiet suburb of Northern Virginia, about 20 minutes from Washington D.C. But I do remember when fights and disagreements and squabbles would happen in Northern Virginia. Like I always felt pretty well prepared, even though I would always very easily get my ass kicked in Glasgow, or run. Actually, more likely to run from a certain ass kicking. Um, I always felt I felt like I was very capable of handling myself in the States. The fighting was just so much less part of the culture here.
What brought your family here?
Well, I was born in the States. My father, he came. He came on a scholarship to Harvard, and he did his part of his studies there. It was, I think it was a scholarship program that was established by John F. Kennedy, called the Kennedy Scholars, where the idea was it's almost like a magnet program where you would bring students from the United Kingdom and I think Europe as well, who were academically excellent, and bring them into the Harvard infrastructure and let them do part of their studies there, part of their graduate degrees. I think it's a postgraduate thing, and then obviously while you're there, you're mingling with the people of Harvard and a whole different, and the international community of Harvard, and that kind of whole academic strata of people, and which for my father was, he had never met people like that before in his life, and it was very much his introduction into the geopolitical structure. And then he ended up working as a speechwriter at the World Bank for about 25 years. And then
And that's what brought the family down to D.C.
That's what brought the family down to D.C. was a job at the World Bank, yeah.
And you grew up in Alexandria?
I was born in Alexandria Hospital, but yeah, grew up a stone's throw from there, yeah.
Did you ever work at Inner Ear Studios?
No, I never worked at Inner Ear, but I became aware of it. I grew up totally unaware of any of the music that had happened in Washington D.C. or that area. But something remarkable did happen to me in Northern Virginia. I was playing. I think we were playing roller hockey. Not is it roller hockey? When you're wearing rollerblades and you're playing street hockey,
Street
right? That's what
hockey,
you call it.
yeah.
Yeah, I was playing street hockey with my friend Tommy Gallagher. And it was the very early 90s, and I had come back from Scotland with a cassette tape that my older, much cooler cousins had made for me, and Nevermind by Nirvana was on one side, and I think Check Your Head or Ill Communication by the Beastie Boys was on the other side. And that was my go-to tape until I ground that thing into dust. So I was obsessed with Nirvana. I was probably around, this was third grade, fourth grade. And we were playing street hockey, and he was talking about Nirvana, and we were talking about how much he loved it. And he said, the drummer lives right there. And he pointed at a house about 7 houses down from his. And, I feel like a lot of kids and adults are fabulists. And I just immediately thought, like, this kid is full of shit. This kid is
Gallagher
lying.
kid? Yeah.
Yeah, is lying. He's just, the drummer from Nirvana lives down here. Drummers from, rock bands, as far as I'm concerned, they lived on the moon. I couldn't even imagine them, doing anything normal or living anywhere normal. I thought of them as mythical people. And he said, "Well, let's go over there and see if he's home." And I shit you not, and this has been corroborated. We went to the front door of this house and knocked, and Dave Grohl himself answered the door. And he said, "Hey guys, how's it going?" I just couldn't believe it. He had the very long hair at the time, and he was holding an acoustic guitar. And I remember very clearly saying to him, "You're a drummer. What are you doing with that guitar?" And he said, "Oh, I play guitar too, And we sat down on his couch, and he just couldn't have been more gracious. He couldn't have been more welcoming. His mother was there. And
was it his mother's house or his house?
It was his mother's house.
Wow.
And my parents now live just a few minutes from it now, even today. And he autographed. I still have the autograph he signed for me, where he says, "Jonathan, hope to make it back to Scotland soon," because he was telling us what great shows they had over there. And he was hanging out with these guys. They were not the other guys from Nirvana, of course. They were just his friends. And I had never seen people that looked like his friends until later in life when, I met my first, like, pot dealers.
Yeah.
I was like, these guys, I was just like, what are these people? What are these guys? They had long hair. They had patches all over their jeans. They were just the coolest looking people I had ever seen in my life. All of my clothes came from Marshalls. I was a schlub. I was just like, who the fuck are these people?
So when did you start hanging out with pot dealers?
Well, I started hanging out with pot dealers when I was 17 years old. I grew up very superstitious, suspicious, and kind of against drugs because I was very, very focused on my studies. I was very, very into school, always.
Was your mom an intellectual as well?
My mother, I think my mother, my mother she's one of the kind of the sharper people that I know. But she was a school teacher, and I always remember her reading the dictionary at night.
Just for fun?
For fun, yeah.
Now, this might get a little bit too involved, but I actually do that too.
Yeah, me too, man.
The OED, to be specific, the Oxford English
Okay.
Dictionary, because I like to study the origins of words.
Okay.
And I have it on a CD-ROM, but now you can buy a subscription online and read it, but I still have my CD-ROM, which I ripped onto a computer.
Yeah, there's something about it. It's just really pleasurable to me, and I'm sure I got it from her, and just that level of interest in words. My father being a speechwriter, my mother being a teacher, and a devourer of books.
So
We
was
had
there a lot of pressure on you to excel academically?
I think so. In retrospect, I mean, I now realize that there was. I felt it at the time, but I'm sure. I don't know what your experience was like, but you're born into whatever you're born into, and you don't. I don't recognize. I didn't at the time recognize it as pressure. I just recognized it as life, and I was much more wary of my parents' judgment on my academic life than I was of even my teachers, because I wanted my parents to be proud of me, and I wanted them to think that I was doing good work. And I was always in pretty strict Catholic schools.
Did you
Up
go to
until
a Jesuit school for high school?
For high school, yeah, I went to Gonzaga College High School, which is an all-boy Jesuit preparatory school.
I went to one of those for my freshman year of high school, and I hated it. But
So you left?
Yeah, I left. I like Jesuits, though. I think that they are the Cadillac of priesthood. You know?
Yeah, I totally agree. And my reasons for liking them so much is none of them ever asked me out. No, I'm just kidding.
It actually turns out that my freshman year theology teacher did get into trouble later.
I think I don't even. Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. Is all I'll say.
Yeah.
Bound to happen when you create that kind of paradigm, I think. But
in my case, it was really my first encounter with organized religion, because my mother came from an Irish American family with 11 kids, and wow, what's that? Is that a baby?
No,
Or
that's
cat?
a peacock.
Oh, it is. Okay.
We have a family of peacocks here in the canyon. It's my first time living amongst these birds, and they are really gorgeous and beautiful, but they're also a handful.
Well, there are wild parrots all throughout Pasadena, and the
Oh, I'm aware
stories
of them.
that-
I used to
yeah.
live in Highland Park, and
Okay,
they used
great.
to roost. They used to roost in the tree behind my
They're
bed.
also very loud.
So loud. Oh my god. And you're like, why? Guys, just go to Malibu. What are you doing? You can fly. I know. Now we're all like the wild parrots, and we can. I don't know. What I mean by that is, I took a drive for fun the other day, and I just drove all around Los Angeles, and it felt like I was on Los Angeles the ride at Universal Studios or something. Like there was just no cars on the road, and I drove from Topanga to downtown and back in 45 minutes. It was incredible.
Yeah, I've spoken to a few people on this show that were part of the music scene in Los Angeles in the 60s. And
Whoa, okay.
It's, according to what they've told me, it was a much better place to live at that time, in many ways.
Yeah, I've spoken to a few people who came from that world as well. I'm one of my dearest friends of recent years was a man named Gary Burden, and he led a
Do you mean the
absolutely
vibraphone player?
No, he wasn't a vibraphone player. He was one of the iconic album cover designers of the
Okay.
60s and 70s.
Is
So
it Burton or Burdun?
Burden,
Okay. I
like
thought you
white
were
man's
saying
burden.
Gary Burton, the vibraphone star.
Oh no. Although I have heard of him as well.
Yeah, I mean, if this air quality is any indication, I would believe them. But anyway, what I was going to say is, when I went to Jesuit school, it was my first encounter with organized religion because my mother had been raised Catholic in an Irish family and become disenfranchised and decided to raise her children in a more agnostic, atheistic fashion. And I was shocked when I encountered it. But I did like the Jesuits.
Yeah, I did too. And even though I was raised in a pretty dogmatic Catholic fashion, I was raised by the nuns of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Northern Virginia, who were a pretty nasty bunch for the most part, with a few exceptions. They were, I think I can comfortably call them anti-intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
And
because
I had
because of dogmatic adherence.
Because of dogmatic adherence, and because of, I think, with the benefit of hindsight, my parents didn't know this. My parents were shocked by a lot of this stuff because, their whole thing was they were raised Catholic. They had become intellectually alive and stimulated through their education, and then their subsequent move to the United States. And, they definitely were traveling far beyond the comfort of their harbor, And so I think they were naturally curious people. They were just putting their kids in Catholic school because they're like, okay, well, we got to, that's the faith we were raised in. We're going to keep it going. They were not particularly devout. They were just obedient and sensible. So they're like, okay, well, let's put our kids in the Catholic school down the street from where we live. And that's what they did. And at the time in Northern Virginia, pardon the pun, had become the cradle of the pro-life movement, which is essentially, there's kind of a far right movement within the Catholic Church, and then kind of became a tool of ascendant right-wing politicians.
Right, and I wonder if its proximity to D.C. has to do with that.
I think that's entirely possible. There's a huge Catholic population because there's a massive Latino population. There's a massive, you know what I mean? There's a lot of reasons, a lot of contributing factors to it. But the March for Life was one of the political events of the year for our school, for our neighborhood. You got the day off from school if you wanted to march for life. And I was unaware of, my parents were unaware of the politics of, legislating women's bodies and abortion and all that stuff. So, I think it was just a particularly militant era of the Catholic Church, which is starting, I think, to soften, simply because even before COVID-19, the churches are empty. You know what I mean? They're empty on a level that, between the plague and COVID, they're not really selling as many tickets as they used to.
Well, they are in third world countries. That's where they're focusing their efforts. But like in Western Europe and in the States, it's not as popular as it once was.
Yeah, and I think that's it's a sign of the times.
Were you a believer when you were young?
Absolutely.
And are you now?
No, not in that sense, not of that faith, not of really anything resembling any kind of Christian modality.
Do you recognize any sort of residual artifacts from your Catholic upbringing in the way that you approach your life, though?
I definitely, yeah. I mean, I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for the obstacles that it placed into my psyche and my life.
Okay, let's drill into that. So, what are some of the obstacles that it placed into your psyche?
I just remember asking so many questions all the time, and I sympathize with my educators because it must have been a fucking nightmare. But I just questioned everything. And when you're in a pretty kind of dogmatic when you're a nun who's trying to educate a little fucker like myself, I can sympathize. But I think I remember feeling a lot of frustration while I was in Catholic education as a child. I remember thinking that the nuns were very rough.
Did they beat you up? Did they hit you?
No, not physically. I mean, they would shove and stuff like that. They would, they were physically intimidating. They are like strangely intimidating when you're near them because they're devoid of form. They're in these kind of rectangular outfits, and you can't really make out their physique or their hairline. So they're just kind of like, kind of like borderline violent giant puppets. And some of them are really sweet. I remember the sweetness of some of them, and there were non nuns in the school as well. Secular ladies who were lovely as well. But I remember feeling a lot of frustration and a lot of fear and a lot of yelling and a lot of disciplining for infractions where I think of them now that were really minor and usually not done by me, but that kind of collective punishment when one does wrong, everybody has to kind of suffer for it. I remember having to drink room temperature milk every day, things like that.
And you're grateful for that experience because the way that you've navigated around it has strengthened you in some way?
Maybe that's just wishful thinking or something. I don't know. I'm just grateful for it because I feel like otherwise my life would have been very comfortable because like I said, it's a pretty quiet suburban existence. Any angst that I've used as any kind of creative fuel, I think came from the experience of being kind of stifled by those nuns and the kind of parochial structure that I grew up in. And I was grateful for having something to be angry about, I guess, if that makes sense.
Right. So then, as you mentioned before, you started hanging out with pot dealers when you were about 17. What had changed by that time?
Something very important changed because I was determined. I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and again, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm the oldest of 4 kids of new immigrants to America who themselves, even though they came from the United Kingdom and people don't see it that way, almost from a third world country in terms of their own economic struggles and the kind of the Irish Catholic experience in the United Kingdom post World War II. I think I really wanted to do well because I think I wanted to be part of the American story. I was very aware of my father's story. I was very aware that he came from very humble beginnings. And, now is no time to just mess around. Now is a time to do well and to advance, I suppose. And that was very much at the forefront of my mind, subconsciously and consciously. And I wanted to do well in school, and I wanted to make a difference in the world, I think. You know, growing up, my father had all the newspapers of the world because of the international nature of his job. The Financial Times was always on the breakfast table, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times of London, Le Monde, all of these newspapers and all of these words. And my dad would quiz me. He'd be like, what are they talking about over here? What is this? What is that? So I kind of wanted to follow in his footsteps to a degree. And I had my eyes on international law, human rights law, that kind of arena, more like to the left politically of what my father was doing. I was the president of the debate team in high school. I was in the honors society. I was pretty much an A student. And then I got in early decision to Edinburgh University back in Scotland. My idea was to go back to Scotland to do my undergraduate degree. And they also had a really excellent political science program there, so I wanted to do that. So I got in early decision my senior year. So October, around Halloween or so, senior year, which was the year 2000, I made this decision to go to Edinburgh University and felt great about it. And again, you got to remember, I'm the first of four children to go through the American educational system. We know nothing about it. We're just learning as we go, my parents and I. I'm very much the guinea pig for the rest of the family for the American educational system. And somebody said to me, like, who had gotten in early to Georgetown, I think, a friend of mine, because I never went out on the weekends. I was always studying. I was always just getting ready, like getting my credits, doing my AP classes, tripling my course load so I could walk into college with extra credits. Someone said to me, he's like, "You got in early to Edinburgh?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "How stoked are you? Like, you're done." I was like, "What do you mean I'm done?" He said, "You don't have to, you can do everything except for fail out of school and you're going to be fine." I was like, I don't understand what you mean. And he said, all you have to do is keep your average at a C or higher, and they won't mail your transcript to your university. So what he was explaining to me is I could fuck off for the first time in my life. I'd been buried under books for years, happily, and didn't have much of a social life, really, didn't really crave one. And he was explaining to me, and so I went around to like double and triple confirm this. And I even went to the guidance counselor. And I remember going into the guidance class, I was like, I've heard these things about the averages and all this stuff, like, and I framed it in a way that didn't seem too suspicious, but he knew what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And he's like, look, yes, it's true that you can do this, but you shouldn't do it. And I was like, okay. And that would begin a many year-long period of me doing things that I shouldn't do.
Like what else?
We'll get into it. But anyway, when he told me this, it truly changed me. And I really devoted myself to smoking pot and listening to music, which I had always done religiously. And I'd always been obsessed with music, but I really, really, really got into it there. And I'd always played guitar, and I'd always played with other people musically, but I never considered it seriously in any way at all. I always thought of it as a hobby, as just an extracurricular activity, one that I was really passionate about, but I had no frame of reference for anyone who'd made their life in music or anything like that. And I it's like a cliche. It's like a too easy part of a made-for-TV movie. I found out that I could fuck off academically, I started smoking pot, and I started a band. And then within a year, by the time graduation rolled around, I had informed my parents that I was not going to be attending the University of Edinburgh in the fall. I was actually going to move to New York City and become, a professional singer-songwriter.
Did you employ the same drive and tools that you had developed to excel academically to your career as a songwriter?
I think so.
Are you the kind of person that plans things out in advance and tries to execute those plans in a methodical way?
I think I'm a mixture of both. I think a mixture of different things. I'm a big believer in letting things happen, but I'm also a really big believer in hard work and focus. And I go with the flow to a certain extent, but I also I also try and control the flow, if that makes any sense.
Can you give me an example of how that works?
Like
maybe we can use this part of your life as an example when you informed your parents that you were not going to go to college and that you were going to New York instead.
Yeah, I informed them of this right before they were going to go on a very long European vacation. So I knew I would have the house to myself for a couple of months. And I had met someone. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Let's back up a second. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Like you're trying to trying to get me to give an example.
No, let's just figure it out. Okay, so you met somebody. Who did you meet?
I met this guy named Chris Keup. Keup. He was a musician that had gone to my high school, and he had graduated several years before me, maybe 8 or 9 years before me. Can't remember exactly. But he had a band, and he had a solo record, and he lived in New York. And I met him through some alumni function at the school, at my high school.
And is he the first person you'd met who was a professional musician?
Absolutely.
I mean, aside from Dave Grohl.
Yep. Aside from Dave Grohl, yeah, that was this, and his existence was much different. I mean, he was
somebody that had gone to the same high school as you and had been on a similar trajectory, and at some point,
he'd been on a similar trajectory, exactly, and he had gone against the trajectory, and he moved to New York, and he started an independent label of his own, and was putting out not only his own music, but he was putting out other artists that he admired and wanted to collaborate with. And he took a shine to me, and I very, very much wanted to be his friend, and we did become dear friends. And I ended up moving into his old room that he was getting rid of his apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I moved into his room. There was 3 bedrooms, so we shared it with roommates. But I moved into his room in his apartment in New York on September 9th, 2001.
Mm-hmm. Trial by fire.
Yeah, I mean, a truly remarkable experience. I was 18 years old. I had only been to New York City twice before that, both times with adult supervision. And I had moved. It's my first apartment. It's my first everything. It's my first foray into the adult world. And in a little less than 48 hours, 9/11 happened. And very much, as horrible as it was, I'm so grateful to have been there at that time.
And what was your day-to-day life like in those days?
In those immediate days, I remember very clearly. I remember I just remember walking so many blocks, and I still do that when I'm in New York. And I think I know everybody walks many blocks in New York. I'm certainly not the first, but I really like to walk like 50 blocks, 60 blocks.
I love doing
and I
that
think
too.
I think it's tied to that my first my inaugural experience in New York, and because all of the public transport was closed, and all the taxis were shut. It was just pure chaos. It was chaos until it wasn't. Once you got uptown, there was very little happening. But I remember eating cookies and lasagna that had been shoved into trash cans right outside the fire stations because they were getting so much donated food that they didn't know what to do with it. And I remember lines of people lined up to give blood. And I remember when I would go down to Greenwich Village, I remember the paper signs that people had made with all the missing people that had died, and well, at the time were presumed missing. And truly one of my most vivid memories is all of these paper signs of all these missing people, hundreds, thousands of signs. And as the autumn wore on, the rains came. And if you were walking around the village and Union Square, that part of downtown Manhattan, there were pieces of missing people blowing around everywhere. These scraps of paper were disintegrating from the rain and the snow and the wind, and they were blowing around everywhere, and then they were gone. And there were soldiers in the street, but I also really viscerally remember people being very kind to one another. So my first experience in New York was a lot of eye contact, a lot of how are you doing, a lot of people trying to connect with one another, which is not the traditional New York experience, right?
It has been in my experience, but it
has been in
it
yours.
wasn't. It's not the stereotypical New York experience anyway.
Yeah, there was no, hey, I'm walking here, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember visiting New York around that time too. But after, the immediate aftermath of 9/11, what were you doing? I know your first EP came out a few years later. So how did you get from moving into this room that you were sharing with your friend Chris to actually recording your own music?
Well, he recorded my first music the summer before I moved to New York. So I had an independent EP that he had produced, and I made 1,000 copies of it, and I put those. I had one suitcase of clothes, a guitar, and then another suitcase that had all these CDs that I was going to sell at shows, and they were going to magically end up in an A&R guy's hands, and I was going to get signed. That was my big idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had probably read. I was big into reading rock biographies at that time. I had probably read a couple of Jeff Buckley biographies, and it's his trajectory because it was so recent. He was dead, of course, but very much his memory was very much alive in the East Village and all the clubs. Chenet was gone, which was the club that he played. That's where I wanted to play. But the Chenet that Jeff Buckley had played had become the Living Room, this place on Ludlow Street. You know that place. So I just booked a show at the Living Room. I think I walked into the Living Room and I gave one of my CDs and said, "Oh, can I play here sometime?" And they said, "Sure you can." After they listened to it, they said, "Sure you can." Steve Rosenthal was the owner with his wife, Jennifer, I believe. And they emailed me back saying, "Yeah, you can have a slot." And I got a slot on the same night, I believe, as a songwriter named Jesse Harris.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesse Harris and I would become great friends, still friends to this day. My friendship with Jesse changed New York for me completely. I was very much kind of a loner in New York before I met Jesse. Jesse's about 10 or 11 years older than me, or maybe more. Sorry, Jesse, but it's true. He was just the epitome of the working New York songwriter. He grew up in Manhattan, born and raised, but he was just every night playing the last remnants of the folk circuit in New York. There were clubs like McCore, which was in the Upper West Side, the Living Room, a few other places. He also intertwined with the jazz world. He was friends with Bill Frisell and Kenny Wallinson, who I didn't know anything about jazz, but I knew that Kenny Wallinson was one of the greatest drummers alive, and that he played on Tom Waits' The Black Rider and knew William Burroughs and stuff like that. I mean, like, I knew who this guy was. And Jesse was just living the life of a musician that like I said earlier, I thought was kind of mythological when I was a child. He lived in an apartment under the Brooklyn Bridge in Dumbo. He took me to Grimaldi's for pizza.
Mm-hmm.
Taught me like about Italian food and sushi and stuff like that. Really took me under his wing. And he had a publishing deal with Sony. And the guy that signed him to that deal, to his first publishing deal, I believe, was this guy named Nate Krenkel. And Nate Krenkel had signed two other artists to publishing deals. He had signed Jesse's friend, Nora Jones, and he had signed Conor Oberst. And one night, Jesse took me to a party at this painter's house in Brooklyn, this painter named Doug Kepsel, who's from the Midwest. I think he was from Milwaukee.
That's where I'm from.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, Doug Kepsel was from Milwaukee. We went to a party at his house, and I believe it was Conor Oberst's 22nd birthday. And that's when I met him. And when I met Conor, we were very similar in age. I'm 3 or 4 years younger than Conor. But he didn't live in New York yet. He was still living in Omaha. But he was coming to New York more and more and loved New York, and I think this is right around the time when he was starting to become quite well known. And he and I became very fast friends from that night onward. And through meeting Conor, that really changed the trajectory of my life. Because first and foremost, musically, I started thinking about music in a very different way than I was.
How did it change?
Well, by listening to Conor's records that were out already, and just the fact that they were on an independent label, and that there was just like this whole kind of infrastructure that kind of traveled with them all over the country, I was unaware of that. I didn't grow up hip in any way. Like I was not aware of indie labels. I wasn't hip like that. I just had my parents' record collection, which was a lot of, 60s and 70s classic rock and singer-songwriter stuff. I was unaware of a lot of this kind of stuff, but I loved the music he was making, and I loved the music a lot of his friends on his label were making. And
Saddle Creek,
yeah.
For those that are listening and don't know.
Yeah, for those that are listening. And the Saddle Creek bands and stuff like that. I was like, oh man, I really love this stuff. And I really felt a connection with it. And also, most importantly, he and all of his friends were very welcoming, very kind people. very, very different from the East Village scene that was happening at the time, which was great music, but it was like it was
Competitive.
again kind of mythological. It was like the Strokes and like lots of models and cocaine and stuff like that. Like great and it's fun, but I'm not invited.
Mm-hmm.
But around that time, also, I did my EP, the independent EP that I had made in Virginia the summer before I moved to New York, got into the hands of an A&R guy at Warner Brothers Records, and I got flown out to Los Angeles, and I'd never been to Los Angeles before, and by the time I left Los Angeles, I had a record deal with Warner Brothers.
So the dream kind of did come true in the way that you imagined it even at your most naive.
At my most naive, the exact thing that I set out to do happened. And even though it looks like I planned it, it is what I wanted. It is exactly what I wanted. But I don't think I could do it again if I tried. I mean, none of us can go back and change it.
Were you trying at the time?
Pardon?
It doesn't seem like, from what you told me, you weren't necessarily trying at the time to get signed to a major label.
Well,
you were You were putting yourself in a position that it could be, the possibility would be greater than if you had, stayed in Virginia.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I put myself in that position, and I definitely, when I felt a connection with someone musically, artistically, I suppose, I always pursued the friendship or whatever it was, but through these, my meeting Jesse Harris and then meeting Connor had nothing to do with me getting the record deal. I had sent out the demos, like old school stuff, but through the mail,
Mm-hmm.
to certain people, and it reached a manager in Los Angeles, and the manager sent it to the A&R guy, and the A&R guy signed me, and I signed with the manager and the label. And that was the deal that I had made with my parents. I said, look, I'm going to give it a year in New York City. And if I don't get a record deal, I'll go to school. And that's the deal. And I think that's fair. And they agreed. But I did get the deal.
Do you think that putting a time limit on it made you more deliberate in what you were doing?
Well, it kind of fell apart towards the end. I ran out of money and had to move back in with my parents.
Where was the money from that you ran out of?
Like series of just the classic New York City bullshit. Just like whatever I could do to make money. Busboy, telemarketing, waiting tables, which is a really good job in New York, especially at that. I mean, right when the economy started to come back after 9/11, it was a really good job. Those kind of things. I walked people's dogs. I watered people's plants. I had to come up with $850 a month to keep that room, and I was able to do it, but then I ran out. I hit a wall before the year was up. I couldn't do it. It was just too hard to make money, and so I went back to waiting tables in Virginia and gigging in New York on the weekends. And that's around the time I got flown out to Los Angeles. And maybe I think the time limit had something to do with it. I think it made me more diligent about following up with people, like making sure that they got my music that I sent and making sure I sent it to the right place and bought enough stamps.
Or even sending it in the first place.
I never had a problem with that. I never felt it never felt like it was beneath me or above me. I just was just like, okay, this is what you got to do. And I would always put a note in there, little thing like that.
Were you confident in your music at the time?
No, I wasn't. I was just a little baby. I'm
Well, often babies are the most confident, right? I mean, artistic
that's
babies.
true. Well, I was not a confident baby. No, I was truly just flailing around. I could barely perform live. I had a cheap little guitar that didn't sound good, and I was really learning. I had performed with my high school band a handful of times. I really was not a fully formed live performer. I only became a fully formed live performer maybe a couple of years ago. But it's just really finding my feet. I think where my music was best coming across at that time was in the studio. And rather than, I think, the classic thing that was happening to them, because back then, I guess I was kind of coming into the music industry at the last gasp of what they would call like artist development. Mm-hmm. So I think Perry Watts Russell, the A&R guy who heard my demos, he didn't think that I had made a masterpiece or anything like that. I think he just saw some potential there, that's what A&R was partly about back then. You don't need to sign something that can make you $1 billion, and as like $1 million overnight. You can develop this artist. This artist could be something with the right people around him, sort of thing. And singer-songwriters were just coming back into vogue, I suppose. At that time, there was a little bit of a...
Yeah, well, you mentioned Norah Jones and Jesse Harris, and soon after you met them, the album they worked on together became one of the biggest albums of the decade.
Mega seller. Yeah, it was incredible, and it's still such a good album too.
But I mean, I would presume that the success of that album opened some doors for singer-songwriters in the record business in general. After that,
I think it did. I think that one. I think there were also guys like Pete Yorn and stuff like that, and John Mayer. People like, I think that in retrospect, if I'm thinking like an A&R guy back then, I think they thought I was more like one of those. I think they were like, okay, well, Warner Brothers needs their John Mayer or their Jason Mraz or their Gavin DeGraw. Mm-hmm. I think those were the type of artists that they were probably thinking they were getting when they got me. And I'm still apologetic, to this day, that's not what I was.
What were you? How would you describe what you were?
I don't know. I mean, I remember I made my first record with Mike Mogus, who made, because I was so in love with all the Saddle Creek records. And he's like, what are you, what's the shit that you're into right now? And I think I gave him, and I know I gave him Some Years, which is the solo album by Colin Blunstone from the Zombies.
1 year, right?
1 year. Yeah, exactly.
And Colin is an alumnus of this show too, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
What an elegant man.
What a great man. And Rod Argent too was on. They were on together. And Rod, I think he helped produce that whole album.
When I used to live in Laurel Canyon, I had a koi pond, and two of the fish in the koi pond, we had a Colin Bluestone and Cod Argent. Anyway, that's for another time.
So that's what you were into at the time. I mean, and for folks that don't know,
I wanted to make a song cycle. I was very into. I was like, what would it sound like if Nick Drake made an album right now? Mm-hmm. What would it sound like if Nick Drake really liked the Lemonheads? And then I remember Mike really perked up and was like, I love the Lemonheads. And so I made this record for Warner Brothers that I thought, I don't know, I think I just kind of fell into a collaboration with Mike Mogus and Nate Walcott as well, who did all the strings for that record. And they kind of made my music sound a lot more complex and interesting than it probably actually was.
How did you feel about your music at the time?
At that time, I felt like I was still learning how to do it. I didn't feel fully formed. I didn't feel that I had arrived artistically. I felt very fortunate to be collaborating with the people I was collaborating with. But I didn't feel totally in charge of it. And probably what I mean is I didn't want to be totally in charge of it.
Do you want to be totally in charge of work that you make now?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yep.
So
I
even
think
say if you're working with somebody who's great on the production side or a mixer, you want to be involved in every decision they make?
not every decision. No, I'm a big believer in delegating responsibility.
Yeah, me too.
I'm a big you. Yeah. Okay. Well, I trust the engineer. I've spent significant portions of my life, as you have, in the studio. But my relationship with the studio has never been a truly technical one. So I'm aware of what a good sound is. I have no idea how to get there. I want to describe it. I want to describe it kind of metaphorically and artistically and get there. But the studio to me, I still walk in there. I'm like, what do all these things do? I love working in the studio, but
Is that intentional? Like, have you chosen not to learn about engineering on purpose because you just want to focus on the
I
craft
mean,
of writing?
honestly, I wish I knew how.
Oh, you do?
I wish I knew how. But I am much more interested in the writing of songs. Like, I've been making records for most of my adult life, and I still don't have any recording gear. I just have guitars. And to me, like, the true test of a song is if I can play it into my phone
Yeah.
and hear it back. Like, I'm testing the quality of the song. And then I've just been very fortunate in my life to collaborate with people who are true sonic architects, people who know how to scientifically and technically achieve sound.
The test of the quality of the song for you is playing it into your phone and then playing it back. So, what that seems to represent is an ability to kind of get outside of yourself. Like when you're playing the song on guitar and singing, you're inside the song, and once you play it back on your phone, then you're a listener, and you can be 1 degree more objective than when you're actually playing it. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think and again, just if the song can survive that very kind of rudimentary recording, if it still sounds compelling and complete to me, that's I'm not even thinking about anything production wise that could make it more impactful.
What is your songwriting process like now?
I haven't written a song in quite a while. I've been writing everything but songs for the past year or so.
What have you been writing?
Put out a book of poetry a couple years ago, and I write poems almost every day. They're haikus. I write them on Instagram, and they're very snarky, oftentimes very disposable observations on modern life. And I've also gotten into the screenwriting game in the past couple of years. I've written a couple of full-length feature films.
Have you gotten? Let's see. Let's see. I'm looking at your Wikipedia page now, so I don't sound ignorant. Okay, you wrote a film called Ricky and the Flash.
I didn't write that film, but I
okay.
got it. But via songwriting, I got into movies.
Got it.
And that's
okay.
That's been kind of the recent development in my life. I think, yeah, I mean, I've always been really, really into movies. I've always been the type of person who watches. If I love a film, I can watch the film 100 times.
Which film have you watched the most times throughout your life?
The film I've watched the most, probably Casino.
Interesting. Does writing movies give you something that writing songs doesn't right now? Like, is it more exciting to you?
At the moment, I mean, I wouldn't say it's more exciting, and I mean, I'm still writing songs, and but yeah, I did it as a way of challenging myself, but I got into movies by writing songs. I was for many years, I was in a romantic relationship and a collaborative relationship with Jenny Lewis. And we wrote many songs together for her records and for mine. And for and then around 2014, I think it was, or 2013, we started writing songs for some films. And we got asked by Anne Hathaway and Adam Schulman to write almost an album's worth of material for this movie, Song 1, which is a very kind of small indie movie about a singer-songwriter and his love interest in Brooklyn, set in early 2000s Brooklyn, New York. And the executive producer of that movie was Jonathan Demme. And I grew up, even though I didn't go to film school, I didn't even go to college, I knew who Jonathan Demme was, and I was a huge fan, like fanboy style. Because
were you a big Silence of the Lambs fan?
Huge Silence of the Lambs fan, huge Stop Making Sense fan as well. And Married to the Mob, I loved all of his movies. And one of the things that always struck me about him was the breadth of his filmography. It was just so diverse. And it's hard to... You can always tell that he's directing the film when you watch one of his films, but the subject matter always changes. He just was interested in everything. But he was the executive producer of Song 1, and he was so hands-on with Jenny and I when we would submit songs to the production. And he was so generous with his time and with his opinion. And then a couple years after we wrote the songs for that movie, he called us and said, would you be interested in writing some music for Meryl Streep in my new movie?
And that was Ricky and the Flash?
That was Ricky and the Flash, right, which ended up being the final film that he would direct before he passed. And so we got to write an original song for Meryl Streep. And that experience was incredible for the obvious reasons that arguably the greatest living actor of our time performs some words and music that we wrote together, that Jenny and I wrote together. That was incredible. But personally, for me, remember earlier in our conversation when I said that the musicians in my childhood seemed mythological to me? Well, so did the movie stars, and so did movies themselves. How does a movie come to be? How does a film happen? There's so many more moving parts to a film than there are to an album or to a record or to a tour or anything like that. It's a wonder that these movies get made. But Jonathan Demme brought me into the production of Ricky and the Flash on the musical side of things. He called us up and we wrote the song. And once the song had made it into the script, which was written by Diablo Cody, Jenny was on tour. This was towards the end of our relationship in 2014, 2015. Jenny was on tour with her album, The Voyager. I was at home in the house that we then shared in Laurel Canyon. And Jonathan called me and said, do you want to come to this place that we've rented up a kind of a musical space up in Laurel Canyon. I know you live there. Do you want to come hang out and give your thoughts? And he invited me into this space where they were basically auditioning Meryl Streep's co-star for the film, and they were trying to decide what songs Ricky and the Flash, which is the name of the band in the movie, should play. And he wanted my opinion on that. And so all of a sudden I just drove up Laurel Canyon, where I'd been living for years, and I drove up Mount Olympus, which is a neighborhood in Laurel Canyon, which is very fitting because it is mythological. And I drove up Mount Olympus, and walked into this room where Meryl Streep had an electric guitar on, and they had a band of session musicians, and they were playing like classic rock songs. And Jonathan kept coming over to me and saying, "What song would you have them play?" And one of the great joys of my life, one of the greatest experiences of my life, was trying to get Meryl Streep to perform Bastards of Young by the Replacements in this movie. It did not make it into the movie. But I was like, I think they should do this song. And we just talked about music and we all played each other records. But what he did for me is he demystified to some degree the filmmaking process for me, and he brought me into it. And he showed me what it's like to work on a set with a producer and a director and a writer and a star and all of these things, and the free exchange of ideas, and the process, which had seemed so mystifying to me, became a little bit less so. And he just showed me that world, a small part of the huge inner workings of his process. And around that time, I became very interested in writing a movie myself.
Have you produced any of those films yet?
No, we're working on it. Takes a long time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've written 2 very, very different films. And yeah, it's I just didn't want to be one of those guys that says, I have an idea for a movie, which everybody has an idea for a movie. It's another thing entirely to put in my case, hundreds of hours it takes to write one, you know?
Well, you are in LA, and everybody in LA has written a screenplay too.
That's the thing. I am finding that out. I lived in LA for a solid decade without ever engaging with that structure, but
Yeah.
the second decade, it felt like the right time to give it a try.
Well, I wonder if any of the skills you developed as a songwriter translated to that process. Like, for example, being comfortable, being, having a bad draft and, working at it and having that creative confidence.
Yeah, and also, honestly, like the cliche, don't bore us, get to the chorus, that really applies in screenwriting.
So
like, you can't waste the space. Something's got to be happening all the time.
So what do you think about the most throughout the day right now?
What do I think about the most? I think often of my family. I think it's strange. I mean, I live in Topanga Canyon. It's impossibly beautiful here. The spring is in full bloom. The air is cleaner than it's ever been in my time in Los Angeles, and any time in 30 or 40 years in Los Angeles. The sun is shining, but there is still the kind of low hum of existential dread.
Is that hum any more noticeable now than it usually is for you?
Do you mean like in a pre and post COVID thing?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, for me, for sure. Oh, I mean, it's palpably different.
Interesting.
For me, like I can't shut it out. I can't. I'm grateful for my circumstances, but I am painfully aware of the circumstances of others. I have a brother that lives in New York who's living with his fiancée in their apartment. And I think of him, and I think of my parents who are, doing their best to spend as much time at home in Virginia. And it's hard for me to shut out. It's hard for me to shut it out totally. And so
do
I
you want to shut it out?
I'm at times,
yeah,
absolutely. At times, I would love to shut it out, and I think I spoke earlier about not getting a ton of stuff done. And I think that's part of the reason I'm not as typically creative as I like. Because I'm typically pretty disciplined about writing, whether it's songwriting or whatever. I like to sit down and I like to get work done.
Do you usually adhere to a schedule?
Yeah. I usually adhere to a schedule. I like to get up and make the series of 2 cups of coffee and work for 4 or 5 hours on something.
It's always the first thing of the day?
Coffee?
Well, yeah, after the coffee, you have designated creative time.
So for you, what you're saying is for you, coffee is inevitable as well?
Yeah. Pretty much. Yeah, it's part of the creative process.
Yeah, I can't imagine it without it. The other day...
I wish I still smoked sometimes.
Oh, man. I haven't missed... I'm a runner. I like to run trails. So that went out. The smoking went out with the running for me years ago. But I totally understand what you're saying. There's nothing like cigarettes and coffee and writing all together. I mean, I've had those moments. I'm very grateful for them. But the other day, and this is if we're lucky enough to get any hate mail for my privilege, here it goes. But I usually take about 3 tablespoons worth of coffee per cup. I ran out of coffee and I had to put 1.5 tablespoons in last week, and I had a headache for 2 days. You ever dealt with anything like that?
I don't get headaches. I don't get withdrawal necessarily. I just
that's what that is, though, right? That's my junkie withdrawal, right?
I suppose it's not really junky, though. I mean, it's not heroin. It's you're not going to get sick.
But it lasted.
Are you drinking coffee right now?
I'm drinking water.
Oh, okay.
No, I only drink coffee in the morning.
Yeah, you are pretty disciplined. See, that's the kind of Jesuit residue that I'm talking about.
Jesidue?
Yeah, Jesidue. Well, no, that's gross.
Sorry.
There's sexual undertones to that word.
You walked right into that one. Testicles, vesticles, wallet.
We never even talked about all the bad things that you alluded to earlier that you did in your life.
We can talk about those.
I don't know if it's interesting, if it's consequential. But
I don't know if it is.
If it's just drugs and things like that, and I've talked about that plenty on this show, and I don't know if it's necessarily all that consequential.
I know. I never really got super into drugs. It was I didn't. I wonder if it was watching the bottom fall out of the music industry that kind of just made that less and less attractive to me. You know what I mean? Like, the rock stars of the 90s had it easy. They were rock stars, of which there are like 5 now. And you could just, like, it seems like you could have, like, you could, like, do a bunch of heroin and still get a record deal. Like, that's kind of, that kind of breed of musician doesn't really exist anymore. Don't you think?
Not that I've encountered.
Everybody's just on their hustle now.
But is that something to romanticize?
Which?
The ability to be a junkie and have a record deal? I mean, I've definitely spoken to people that have lived that life, and it often didn't end in a very happy way, and it also kind of robbed them of the joy of having a giant audience at that time.
No, I'm just merely pointing out that I think I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I know what you're getting at. Like right now, everybody's thinking of themselves as a small business, as a musician.
Yes,
in a way
exactly.
that before
and way before the pandemic, of course.
Yeah, and to me, that's consistent with the ethic that I espoused as a young person, looking up to the bands that you were oblivious to in DC, like Fugazi, who ran their own record label and booked their own tours. It's sort of like DIY, but I think it's also been commodified in a way with social media where there's and with streaming where everything is quantified now. How many
even if you're, I don't even know what it's like for the DIY kids now.
I don't either, but yeah, I recently only signed my first major label record deal, and the conversations are so interesting. It's really, we're talking about how to get the largest streaming numbers and social media and ads like that, how to optimize things online. And, as far as I can tell, it's not really that much different from the heyday of major labels in the sense that they're there to, try to market something that you made as a product and find an audience for it. And, but in some ways it's very different. And obviously there's less money at stake. So it's kind of shocking to me, that the behemoth record labels still function in a way that was set up when there was a lot of money at stake.
Yeah, it is fascinating. But I think that what I'm really driving at is I think a different type of person is, like someone like Elliott Smith. I didn't know Elliott personally. I know a bunch of people that did. That's neither here nor there. I didn't know him personally, but I just can't really imagine a guy like Elliott being forced into getting on the phone with his, digital marketing person and being like, what would really love for you to do, Elliott, is to collaborate with this
brand,
herbal face mask brand on their story and just kind of take over their Insta for a few hours on Friday.
Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, you're right. But on the other hand, there's always been some artists that were doing things like that and were doing.
Oh, of course.
But not the same. It's like during that time, Michael Jackson was doing Pepsi commercials or whatever, but the replacements were not, to use a band that you referenced before. There was.
Yeah, no, of course.
But yeah, I don't know. I think everybody's still trying to figure it out.
I think also
do you know how to do you know how to sustain a music career? Do you know what your strategy would be if you were launching a new career as an artist right now? Would you have a strategy?
No, I don't. Right now, like today?
Yeah.
Man, I don't know, and my heart breaks for. Because I get not to wind down our conversation on a darker note, but
let's do it.
I just have the perspective now of, I'm 36. I was signed to a big, juicy record deal, one of the last of its kind, when I was a teenager. And I'm so grateful for that. I know that it was kind of lopsided in terms of what I deserved or whatever that word means. Does anyone deserve a big fat advance for not, at any time? But anyway, that's what they were giving back then. And that's what I got. And it very much allowed me the space as a very young man to live as an artist in a kind of consequence-free environment, financially speaking, for a few years and learn about the process of songwriting. That era is long gone, but then the streaming era came in. So it's okay, that ushers in the era of you're a road dog and now you tour your music. And if you're down for that life, if you're willing to sleep on the floors and then eventually go get in one hotel room where everyone's sleeping on the floor, then everybody gets their own hotel room, then you're on a tour bus. If you're willing to play that game, the real working musician's game, now that's gone. And who knows when it's coming back. Mm-hmm. So the streaming services have taken away a lot of the income that a lot of us enjoyed through the 90s and the early 2000s. Now the touring has been taken away temporarily, but we don't know when it's coming back.
Well, that's why it's a perfect time to forge a partnership with an herbal face mask brand.
Believe me.
Jonathan Rice, thank you so much for being on the show.
Nobody cared who I was until I put on the mask.
The Trap Set is produced by me, Joe Wong, along with Chris Karwowski, who also edits the program. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Trap Set, and visit our website, thetrapset.net, to subscribe to our show for free. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please donate to our show. If you can't afford to donate, please tell a friend and give us a good rating on iTunes. Send your feedback and guest requests to thetrapset@gmail.com.